Our sermon text today is likely very familiar to most of you. It comes from Luke's Gospel, chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. Listen with new ears tuned to God's presence among us today. Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" And he answered, "Well, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, with all your strength, and all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus said to him, "You've given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into robbers?" The lawyer said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." Please join me in prayer. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Now, my uncle is a lawyer, and I know we've got a lot of lawyers here among us, so I don't mean this to be offensive, but my uncle, he is not a man prone to giving free advice. But there is one thing that he will tell just about anybody: never ask a question that you don't already know the answer to. There's a reason that witnesses rehearse. Surprises are never good, and an unexpected reversal, a side note, it can ruin a case. So Jesus is moving towards Jerusalem, and he has got a crowd following, these new 70 people. And this lawyer, he would have been an expert in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, all that stuff that each of us reads with such rapt attention before dinner every day. He would have been an expert in that stuff, and he has heard that Jesus, he's sent out all of these folks to preach and to teach and to exorcise demons, and now the lawyer is hearing that they have returned to Jesus and they have been successful. And the lawyer is getting a little nervous. And to be frank, Jesus is getting a little bit preachy for his liking. So seeing his chance to trip up and perhaps shut up this wandering madman, the lawyer stands up among all gathered, and he starts asking questions. Here's how I imagine it. Sam Waterston, as Assistant District Attorney Jack McCoy, from every rerun of Law and Order airing every minute of every day on every channel. There's a look that Waterston as McCoy gets when he knows that he has trapped a witness, when he is leading this poor fellow to a conclusion whose implications the witness has not yet worked out. McCoy's genius is his ability to trap these people in their own logical systems, to force them to admit some lie, some inaccuracy, some piece of incriminating evidence, or a fundamental misunderstanding of the law. So I have decided today to call our young lawyer Ancient McCoy. Now, Ancient McCoy is testing Jesus. What must I do to inherit eternal life, he asks. It's a reasonable question, and he knows full well the answer. He must have been delighted when Jesus turned the question back to him. Why, of course, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Jesus agrees. Good, yeah, that's good. Go and do that. But Ancient McCoy is disappointed. He wanted a rise out of Jesus. He wanted to prove something to Jesus, so he presses him further. And McCoy, he doesn't ask about God or love, all that hard stuff that he probably doesn't know the answer to. He lobs another softball. And who is my neighbor? Luke tells us that this is his attempt to justify himself. In the face of this strange teacher, his disciples, and his followers, Ancient McCoy needs to establish a sense of authority. And inquiring about neighborhood regulations will provide him precisely that opportunity. So he prepares his answer. Neighbors are your people. They're Jewish folks who can trace their lineage back to the Babylonian captivity. Neighbors are the folks with whom I share DNA markers, with whom I share customs and language and preference and skin tone, unless we forget the simplest answer. Neighbors are the folks who live next door. Now, before we get all upset with McCoy, you've got to remember he's right. Neighbors are near. The words are related in both English and Greek, and in fact, the Greek word here might be better translated as nearnesses. Neighbors are neighbors precisely by virtue of their proximity to our home and our likeness and our way of life. Non-Jews, aliens, strangers, immigrants, they were not Ancient McCoy's nearnesses. That is his world, and we should recognize it because that's our world. It's self-sustaining, it's self-sustained. It's isolated from significant difference. It's inward. Ancient McCoy, he knows it. The religious leaders know it. The crowds know it. We know it. Everybody knows it. That is the way the world works. Everybody except, it seems, per usual, for Jesus. Ancient McCoy must have been totally blindsided because Jesus doesn't simply answer, oh, well, your neighbor is this or that. Your neighbor is everyone, or your neighbor is no one. And neither does he turn the microphone back as he had done before. Jesus decides to tell a story. Now, Jerusalem is 2,500 feet above sea level, and it can be cold. And Jericho is 700 feet below sea level, and it is warm. It's balmy. Ooh, the air is good. It is Israel's #1 vacation getaway, especially for church leadership, folks like the priest and the theologian Levite who need to get away from all that holy hubbub every once in a while. I can see it now, the billboard that hangs over the temple in Jerusalem. Imagine that you can get from Westchester to Key West in under 4 hours. Travel Jericho Road. But robbers have gotten wise to all the priests and the Levites and the rich folks always passing through, and the highway has become a hotbed for criminal activity. Somebody was always getting robbed or beaten up. Best then not to make eye contact. Best to hurry along. Hope the sun will stay out for a bit longer. Best to tuck away your money in a secure little fanny pack so it's safe from pickpockets and criminal tomfoolery. So it's safe from the world. You got to look out for #1, I always say. Now, I have occasionally, and this might be hard to believe for those of you who've gotten to know me, I've occasionally found myself in the middle of an explanation when I suddenly realize that I have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about anymore. It's gone. I have forgotten the question, I've forgotten the premise, I have forgotten all of it. And because of that, I have no real idea what the end game of my answer is. But you better believe that I will not stop talking. It's better to keep going, right? Let's dazzle/confuse them with my verbosity in hopes that they won't realize that I have lost track of every single thing except for my own internalized panic. Ancient McCoy must think at this point that something similar is happening with Jesus, that he has forgotten the question entirely, or that he's pulled this interview 101 move where if they ask you a question you don't know the answer to, you just answer something you do know. Because Jericho, by no measure, is a part of the neighborhood. But McCoy, he knows better than to stop a rambling witness. Let Jesus talk himself in circles until everybody realizes just what a fool he is. Jesus continues. So one day, there is a man on the road, and he has been severely beaten. He's stripped of his possessions. He's left for dead. And unsurprisingly, a priest comes by. But he sees the man. He tightens his fanny pack, and he picks up the pace. After all, come to think of it, this could be a trap. You go help that man, and you find yourself in his position. And what kind of man is he? Help him and face litigation, that's what I think. No good deed goes unpunished, after all. He'd likely claim that my horse gave him whiplash. Better to get on to Jericho. There are dinner reservations to keep. Then there's a Levite, right? A learned man, a good, holy man. He too sees the fellow in the ditch. But like the priest, he's got somewhere to get to. And on top of that, he does not like the sight of blood. It makes him faint. And it is certainly unclean. Better to walk on than to risk some infection, some nasty thing that would leave him impaired, unable to complete all of his tasks in the temple, and therefore unable to provide an invaluable service for the community. Why, it might even kill him. Better to get onto Jericho, have a swim in the refreshing saltwater pool. So he sails calmly by. Yes, certainly, this is great for McCoy. Jesus has forgotten the question. This story, it seemed, was shaping up to be about hypocritical church leaders. Ancient McCoy, readying his retort, he would have nonetheless recognized in Jesus' story a rhetorical pattern. Storytellers in those days used it all the time in moral teaching. A pious man fails in his moral duty, a learned man fails in his action. The next traveler, according to the formula, down the road should be a simple Jew, a simple religious man, whose bold assistance would shame the priest and the Levite and expose their hypocrisy. In this story, Jesus is betraying to McCoy that he knows something, but McCoy must still think he has the upper hand. How shocked then must he have been when Jesus sends a Samaritan down the road? Now, we are used to hearing good alongside Samaritan, but it would have been a mighty blow to just about every Israelite in earshot. Samaritans were not good. They were unclean, they were threatening, they were foreign, their religion was strange, everything about them was different. Jesus may as well have sent a good member of the Taliban down the road. That's how shocking it would have been. The two terms were thought to be mutually exclusive. And McCoy, he must have been sort of reeling from confused delight at this point, because what is Jesus talking about? Anyway, he lets him keep going. Jesus continues. This awful Samaritan, he came near that dangerous body, and what he saw moved him to pity. Without the slightest hesitation, without even a trace of doubt, this Samaritan, this hated man, he acts. And his action is generous beyond imagination. He dresses the injured man's wounds with expensive, fine medicines. He bandages him and he carries him to his horse. And then he walks that horse to the nearest inn where he takes care of the man. He misses his dinner reservations. And later, he notices that he is covered by the same mud and dirt and blood that once caked the man. But he doesn't seem to care. This poor lawyer hasn't even recovered from all of this nonsense when Jesus turns the table a final time. But the question is no longer, who is my neighbor? We miss this a lot in our reading. It is no longer who is our neighbor, but rather who was a neighbor to this man. It is a simple reversal with profound consequences. Jesus has taken a question of legal obligation. What are the fixed boundaries of the entity neighborhood, and transformed it into an opportunity for hospitality, an event of mercy that breaks open the tidy, self-contained boundaries of the world. Ancient McCoy is reeling, and we should be too, because this is an overwhelming task. This is an impossible task. We can never be as good as the Good Samaritan. We cannot save the world. We can't bind up every wound, and we barely have ointment enough for ourselves. Now, this might be an unusual text to kick off our program year, but I think it is particularly appropriate. Because who is the Good Samaritan? Who is the Good Samaritan if not Jesus Christ? And what are we to do if not be Samaritans for this world? God's love for us, for each of us, is not some saccharine sentiment. It is not a feeling. God's love for us is the concrete reality of the Good Samaritan. It is action. It is free movement of mercy that in Jesus Christ picks up we broken humans and carries us alongside the dark highways and corridors that make up the maps of our lives. Jesus Christ is the despised outsider. He is the strange Samaritan. And we can tell ourselves all day long that despite our bruises and broken bones, we can carry ourselves through this life alone. But the truth is that we need the Samaritan. We need the one who has lavished us with the finest medicines of mercy and carried us to the nearest end. And he did it not out of some necessity, not because it was owed to us, but out of freedom, out of the always outward moving mercy and abundant grace that brims over from the divine life onto every highway and street corner in town. And here is the good news for us, in case we're getting overwhelmed. God hasn't asked repayment, only that until he returns to the inn alongside Jericho Road, we go and do likewise. Go and do likewise to whomever the neighbor on whatever the street. That is the call that echoes forth from Gower to Sterling to Pleasant Valley to McDaniel Avenue. That is the call that echoes from Jerusalem to Jericho to Augusta Road. No longer can we attempt to justify ourselves by asking God to limit mercy, to contain the Spirit's wild, unruly movement outwards. That is ancient McCoy in us. That is a worried priest. That's the erudite Levite. That is a way of a world that does not recognize its own redemption. We are called to be Samaritans. And if we turn our heads, embarrassed of God's lavishness towards all these riffraff and rabble-rousers, we'll be forgiven our temporary failure. But we will not be excused from the future. We will not be excused from the neighbor forever. We have been called by the Good Samaritan to be good, to be nearnesses for the world, so that the world, in knowing mercy, might know God. We have been called to nearness, and it is better to fail in our attempts to bind up this broken world than to pass by on the other side of the highway, afraid of what damage the wounded world might do to us, or how much worse we might make it if we try. Jesus walked alongside Jericho Road, healing and exorcising demons and preaching and teaching. He walked all the way to Golgotha, to the cross. Go and do likewise. In our worship and in our prayer, in our service and in our action, we must always look beyond ourselves. And when we leave these pews, it must be with eyes wide open and a heart truly ready to be as neighbor. Not inwardness, not self-preservation, love, mercy, nearness. Folks from this community are coming to stay with us this week for Gain, and that is a great place to start. It's really wonderful, and it's something to be proud of, but it can't only be Gain, it can't only be United Way or Habitat. Neighborliness must become a part of our everyday discipleship, a part of our attitude toward the world. It's not seeking out danger, it's not acting brashly, it's being open, seeing with clear eyes the folks around us so desperately in need of nearnesses. Coach Taylor used to always say on Friday Night Lights, clear eyes, full hearts. Can't lose. Ancient McCoy, he may have been right, but the Samaritan was good. Every week, Mr. Rogers asked if we would be his neighbors. It is a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you? Could you be mine?